So, this popular YouTuber called thunderf00t recently released a video called Everything You Need to Know About the Brexit. That is the referendum on whether the UK should leave the European Union. So the video argued that we should remain in the European Union. And unlike a lot of his other videos, I think thunderf00t made some misleading claims, and some of his arguments were incomplete. So what I'm going to do is examine some of the arguments made and try to offer my own rebuttal, and then give a case for why I think we should leave the European Union. I can't promise the production values will be as good as thunderf00t's video, because I'm trying to get this done within a couple of days. And unfortunately, unlike the great Davis Arini, I do not know all the keyboard shortcuts.
In many ways, it's a sort of similar thing with Britain's referendum on leaving the EU. And for me, I wonder if Europe has the same sense of humour, and that if Britain chooses to stay, whether they're all going to have a referendum on whether they should expel Britain from the EU. I mean, in many ways, the mere fact that you're having this referendum, just like with Scotland, kind of undermines the very essence of the whole concept of, say, a united kingdom. Voting to leave Europe, voting to leave your seat at the table, just kind of splits the very concept of a united Europe.
thunderf00t here attempts to draw an analogy between the recent Scottish referendum for independence in 2014 and the current referendum on the European Union, to give a broader argument in favour of a concept of unity. Unity is not necessarily a bad concept, providing it is consensual and does not contradict a democratic will for independence or self-determination. Scotland is under no illusion that it is part of a country called the United Kingdom. The referendum in 2014 would have made Scotland an independent country. The European Union, by contrast, doesn't claim to be a country, despite acquiring attributes commonly associated with statedom, such as a flag, parliament, and proposals for a foreign policy, or even an army. We can at least say that Scotland consented to remain part of the United Kingdom. However, if we vote to remain, that does not mean the UK has given consent to become part of a European state, which it looks more like now than it did in 1973, when the UK voted on joining a common market. In 40 years' time, it's likely the European Union will look even more like a country than it does now. But while there is almost no desire for deeper European integration, a desire for greater devolution of power is a natural process as a country becomes larger and more diverse. The political, economic and cultural distinctiveness of Scotland is part of the reason that it nearly did become independent. And we should not forget that Scotland, despite remaining part of the UK, obtained even more control over its own affairs from the UK after the referendum. This is in stark contrast to the UK's own position within the European Union.
I mean, America had a similar sort of deal with this sort of thing. When the South decided it wanted to leave, it was going to secede and keep its slaves, which is what, of course, led to the Civil War, a war which killed more Americans than any other in history.
Or, of course, Yugoslavia. But it's worth noting that war isn't so much caused in cases like this by separatism, but rather the rejection of self-determination by the Union. This is why, if there is sufficient desire, within reason, for independence, it is usually a good idea to let the people decide. For example, in the case of allowing the Scottish people to have a referendum on their own potential independence.
Now, naturally, if this was some smaller bit player, like, say, for instance, Norway, then you could probably make something like the Brexit work, and it wouldn't be such a big deal. I mean, hell, more people live in London than in Norway. But this is Britain talking about leaving the EU, one of the largest pieces. Damn straight, that's going to destabilise things.
The UK's large size is actually a fairly strong basis for suggesting it'll be able to survive economically outside of the EU. In terms of destabilisation, there is some truth therein that a Brexit could trigger other countries to have their own referenda and eventually also leave. But this is a destabilisation of the European Union, not of the Europe itself. And while destabilisation of any sort is hardly desirable, it is best to get out now and let the European project continue to damage the continent, for example, through its currency union. And I'm actually aware that the UK is not in the Eurozone, but this is a more relevant point with respect to the damage the EU is doing to southern European countries.
But then again, Britain's political system is pretty farcical itself, that there aren't many countries who can boast that they elected a Prime Minister who allegedly defiled a dead pig.
Det var en Stefan Löfven att få en örfil. Och på den vägen fortsatte det.
Now, this really isn't about whether Europe is a farce or whether Britain's politics are a farce. It's about what's the best option on the table for Great Britain. For me, it's a simple costs-benefits analysis. What are the costs and what are the benefits? Well, primarily, the European Union is a trading bloc. That trading bloc has rules. Maybe England is slightly better off on the inside, maybe slightly better off on the outside. And people argue over those small differences. But the one thing that you're guaranteed of, and this is something that almost no one has highlighted, is going to be a gargantuan pain in the arse for everyone. New rules will have to be written and negotiated with everybody. And then everybody who actually trades with the UK is going to have to learn those new rules. It's a colossal waste of time, effort and money.
This is arguably the most momentous point of the entire video, that we should not leave the EU because deals all around the world would have to be rewritten, and therefore there would be global disruption. But as it turns out, this is actually completely wrong. Martin Howe, QC, a legal expert in the UK, goes into the analysis of this claim in detail on the Lawyers for Britain website. However, I'm only going to outline the most important points here. Firstly, in the case of trade deals the UK has with specifically non-EU countries, it's very important to note that the UK is also a party to these agreements as well as the EU, which means the terms would continue exactly how they are, with no need for any kind of renegotiation. There would literally have to be no alteration to the current deals, and it's little more than rubber stamping an existing deal. In theory, things could be more complicated if the trading partner chooses not to accept the current deal. However, there is absolutely zero precedent for this. The website also gives an empirical justification for this claim by looking at the case of the breakup of Czechoslovakia into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And of course, these two constituent countries do not have to spend a huge amount of time and money renegotiating trade deals. The status quo was largely preserved. Secondly, for EU trade, there would have to be a certain degree of renegotiation. However, the EU would grant us a 2-year renegotiating period after the Brexit happens. So even if no trade deal can be negotiated in that time, though, the UK would be able to revert to our trading relationship guaranteed by the World Trade Organization, which would involve being outside of the slightly less desirable common external tariff. But this is the worst case scenario.
England already has border controls, unless you're going to impose some sort of visa requirements on the entire of Europe, which would be kind of pointless unless you've got a competent intelligence service that can successfully screen out all of the problems.
Well, not quite. Unlimited free movement is not quite the same thing as purely visa-free travel, which would most likely remain upon Brexit. But free movement as it stands means the UK has no control. Even if we accept the ability to control a border with the EU would be largely ineffective, it has to be the epitome of short-sightedness to language in a situation where that control is not even afforded as an option. Leaving the EU means an EU passport doesn't confer an instantaneous right to settle in the UK, and it would likely lead to a more equitable immigration policy between EU and non-EU countries.
But you may still well say, doesn't the EU cost us £150 million a week? Well, okay, let's say there are 75 million Brits. That means that the average Brit pays about £2 a week, or £100 per year. That means that Europe costs your average Brit about as much as a TV license. Is that really deal-breakingly expensive?
Another way you could look at this, of course, is as a couple of years' worth of austerity cuts. Of course, austerity has been a rather contentious issue in the UK politics. But there is this fundamental misunderstanding that you're only losing this amount per year. However, there's this concept of the fiscal multiplier, because some of this taxpayer money is being lost in terms of potential growth which has been sacrificed in the economy, and this accumulates over years and ultimately decades while we stay in the European Union. I've skipped over a rather larger section where Thunderfoot discusses visa travel, and I touched on this earlier. Restriction of free movement doesn't mean visa travel, and there would be no precedent for it. There were a few other minor points about specific research and the status of expats, which I won't go into great detail other than to say actions which cause reciprocation would be in no one's best interest, although I will concede I can't guarantee everything will work out for everyone, though. But in any systems change, there are going to be winners and losers. It's just whether overall the system is a system change would be a net positive or a net negative.
Rule, to a very real extent, Britain can't leave. Britain, England, Great Britain, whatever, doesn't matter, is a set of islands off the coast of Europe, and geographically it's not going anywhere. The majority of the trade will still be done with the European Union, and that will have to be governed by rules. Unless you've got some massive beef with those rules as they are at present, which as far as I can tell is almost no one, then what the hell is the point? You're just changing one set of trading laws for a bloc to another set of trading laws for the bloc, all while throwing a massive wrench into the works of any UK company that trades with anywhere else in the world, and vice versa. None of this really makes any difference anyway. Britain's not just geographically close to Europe, it's financially close to Europe. If Europe's going down, it doesn't matter if Britain is in or out. Britain's going down with it. Changing the trade rules might make you feel better, but fundamentally it won't change the close financial proximity of Britain and its trade with Europe.
Yes, the UK is financially coupled to Europe. However, a Brexit would mean some risk mitigation. The status of Southern Europe is one of stagnation or recession, and the accumulation of toxic debt. It is likely if the UK stays within the European Union, then taxpayers' money would eventually have to be used in bailouts, and this would not be the first time it has been done. More importantly, leaving the EU would allow a policy of trade liberalisation to diversify trade, that is, to trade more with non-EU markets, and therefore reduce the risk of becoming overly dependent on a European market, and by extension the ramifications of an economic collapse.
Wars are born of instability, and at its simplest, can anyone dispute of all the things that the UK could do, that leaving the EU would be a step towards instability in Europe, one of the largest pieces of the European Union pulling out. It would be a step towards a more polarised Europe. There would be us, and there would be them, a step towards old Europe. One tiny step to be sure, but nonetheless one step closer.
I do agree that war is born out of instability. However, the instability associated with leaving the European Union now may be far less than potential issues in the future if the EU becomes more centralised. Look, one of the factors that promotes instability is the artificiality of state boundaries, which is something that has quite a lot of empirical evidence behind it. You only have to look at how artificial borders in the aftermath of the colonial era have led to ethnic, religious and political tensions and civil war. Part of the reason Syria has so many problems is because it's not a well-defined country. The Kurdish people of the north have a different identity to those in the rest of Syria, and this is the fundamental problem with Europe. There is no pan-European identity. An increasingly centralised union of member states is as artificial as in design as Syria. Indeed, we can look at Yugoslavia as an example of a country that was a failed unification project because it suppressed the national identities of its 6 principalities. Now, of course, it is possible to have a successful artificial country. Switzerland would be an excellent example of a conglomerate with different languages, ethnicities and identities that has become successful. However, the key to success is a federal model. Switzerland enjoys high autonomy and devolution of power. It did not make the mistake of excessive centralisation. However, the same cannot be said of the EU. The European Union is becoming more centralised, and whether or not it eventually does become a United States of Europe, the results are increased nationalist tendencies through a promotion of artificial conglomerate without compensation by increased autonomy. Also, it's worth noting the us versus them division already kind of exists when you look at Southern Europe, which is been the more adversely affected by European integration, with Northern Europe. German taxpayers, for example, might feel annoyed at the prospect of having to bail Greece out, while Greece feels justifiably screwed over by the Eurozone. Further, the fundamental contradiction between free movement and migrant quotas has stoked further animosity between EU nations, and countries near the external border, such as Slovakia, have adopted a less tolerant attitude towards migration in recent years. The bottom line is the EU is a cause of instability anyway. While leaving the EU may be an additional instability, in my view, it is better to leave on amicable terms now than continue down the path of centralization, which historically has not ended well. Of course, leaving the EU may indeed improve relationships between EU countries, because since the UK is seen as an EU member, it has these sort of special privileges. That's how it's seen by other EU members, such as its opt-out with the Schengen zone. So it's conceivable this could actually improve relationships between the UK and other EU nations.
Immer wenn Europa dich nervt, ziehst du einfach eine
Extrawurst!
Die anderen Spacken zahlen ein und du bist der Einzige, der sich was rausnimmt. Wie geil ist das denn bitte? Extrawurst, das Spiel, bei dem England immer gewinnt. Vorsicht, da kommt ein Boot voller Flüchtlinge. Aber nicht mit dir. Du ziehst einfach die Extrawurst! Schick die Afrikaner mal schön Richtung Kontinent. Und wenn die Festlandpfeifen sich dann aufregen, sagst du einfach
Tea time!
Extrawurst. Das große Europa verarschen. Ein Spiel, das langsam echt keinen Spaß mehr macht.
For what tangible gain? If you're just voting exit because it feels good, I understand your protest vote. But in practice, it's just going to be a very costly change for Britain to something that is more or less exactly the same as it was in the first place.
But I haven't actually addressed the benefits yet. What would be the actual benefits of leaving the EU? Well, for that, I'm afraid you're going to have to wait until another video, where I will cover the actual benefits and positive reasons for leaving the EU in a future video. In the meantime, you can have a look at a skip video that I did recently on the Remain campaign and Project Fear, or you could subscribe to my channel for more videos on physics, politics and so on. Thank you very much for watching. I hope this has been informative.